Ancient societies cherished water, molded their lives around it, and even worshipped it as a god. For whatever reason, between 800 and 1000 AD, climate change dried up most of the Mayans' local water supply. Farmers were forced to extend their agriculture into the jungle forests to grow food. There was not enough water for both the crops and trees, so the forests died. The soil eroded, air humidity decreased, food decreased. Mayan leaders prayed to the god of rain, but the regular rain season brought little water. The hydrologic cycle was damaged. Life in the cities became less civilized, as the main focus of Mayan life became providing food and water. People abandoned the cities to begin a new life in the forests, in hopes that there was still a sustainable watershed there. There wasn't.
When it rains, the water falls from the clouds down all the way to the ground. It soaks into the ground and then the grass and trees grow. Sometimes there's so much water underground that lakes and rivers just pop up, like when you squeeze a box of apple juice. The rivers carry the water back to the ocean. Inside the ocean, the water floats up to the sky as clouds again. Then the wind pushes the clouds towards the land and it rains again. This all happens over and over, forever and ever.
How is our water being polluted? Agriculture uses chemicals to increase farming productivity. Ironically, implemented to counter a diminishing water supply, these chemicals pollute the groundwater. Automobile gas emissions pollute the clouds. But perhaps the most damaging culprit is industry. Water pollution has been linked to the rising miscarriage rates in women, lower sperm counts in men, and it is so globally severe that the Malaysian government proposed the death penalty for anyone caught contaminating water.
What we now know is that we are polluting and depleting this finite stock of fresh water so fast that we're now mining the groundwater faster than it can be replenished.
It rains. The water hits the ground and percolates into the soil, collecting underground into what are known as aquifers or groundwater. But how much of our finite supply of water is underground? We can only estimate, as there is no reliable method to accurately measure, which is why our growing dependency on groundwater is such an urgent concern.
The fabled Atlantis in the Middle East had a real city attached to it. It was called Ubar. It disappeared and no one could figure out what happened. And then some archaeologists found it. What they realized is it collapsed into the desert sand from groundwater pumping. Not only could it happen, it is happening today in Florida. Giant sinkholes have emerged, all of a sudden just big cavities in the ground opening up.
The effects are not always evident, as with a sinkhole or lost city. Entire regions can slowly and evenly sink as a watershed is depleted.
Perfect example is where Mexico City is now. There was once an oasis of water. When the Spanish came, they didn't want their new city to look like Venice. They wanted it to look like Madrid. And they used slave labor to cut down all the trees that would protect the water sources and to dredge the water systems. And what happened was that they just destroyed the water table. And of course, that was one thing when there were 10,000 people living there. It's another when there are, maybe 25 million. They've taken the rest of the water underneath the city. The city is literally sinking in on itself, and these great big churches are beginning to, go sideways. And Mexico is having to go further and further and further away from its local water sources, because there aren't any left, to find water.
Human ingenuity has found out ways to get water from beneath the surface of the earth for thousands of years. What's changed, though, is the technology. We now pump approximately 30 billion gallons of groundwater every day. community started tapping into our aquifers at a time when there really were not other demands on the resource. The way that the law works is that they're allowed to use limitless quantities. And then the added kicker is that the law said, if you don't use it, if you don't divert all of this water, you may lose your water right.
So with that scenario, it doesn't encourage conservation of water. I mean, why am I going to go ahead and quit pumping to save water and lose everything? So then a guy like me who may want to quit pumping to quit depleting the aquifer, I have to keep pumping in order to keep my water rights.
When we pump water for such irrigation, some of it percolates back into the ground, which is called recharge or return flows. So long as we pump no more than what is recharged, we are using the groundwater sustainably. The problem is that we're pumping up to 15 times more water from the ground than is returning back into it, creating a global crisis.
One thing that most people don't know is that the world is desertifying very quickly. We are becoming a desert in many places.
Our soil is eroding, simply meaning that overgrazing, winds, and flooding damage the top layer of Earth, essentially hardening it to the point that rainwater cannot easily soak into the ground. Our life source literally slips away from us, back into the ocean through sewers and rivers, draining the land of its moisture and life.
Že krajina, ktorú človek vysušuje, sa mení zo zelenej na žltú a výsledkom potom je, že všetká voda je skumulovaná v oceáne.
Extreme weather, a world of hurricanes and violent storms over the ocean, while the interior land receives less and less rain, or violent, harsh storms that simply erode the land more.
Zemská kôra kontinentu odľahčuje a príspevok kumulácie tejto vody v oceánoch spôsobuje zaťaženie zemskej pôdy, kôry, čo môže spôsobiť pnutie v štruktúrach zemskej kôry a to spôsobuje zemetrasenie a potenciálne možné tsunami vlny, ktoré sme boli svedkami v roku 2004.
Deforestation is a major contributor to soil erosion. Tree roots absorb water and thus hold the watershed in place. When they leave the land, so does the water.
Because the forests that held the water have all been logged, there is no place where the water can be stored. The rain still comes and runs away as instant surface runoff.
Just what I feared. He's formed a gang, and they're whooping it up for a flash flood. They're rushing down the canyon. They've made a wall of water 20 feet high. Look out! No longer satisfied with flash floods, the gang is planning bigger and wetter floods. Junior's getting dangerous. He's getting tougher and bolder every day.
But groundwater pumping cannot alone be blamed for our desertification crisis.
Cities are growing and expanding. For the first time in human history, more people living in cities than in the countryside.
We've replaced permeable ground with hardscape, with roofs, with parking lots, with homes.
If it rains and the water doesn't hit the ground but hits the sidewalk or street instead, it can't soak into the ground and make trees. It just slides down the street back to the ocean and makes more clouds. This means that the ground gets really dry and the grass and trees die.
Clearly, there is much more unpaved than paved land in the world, but the effect is cumulative and should not be underestimated.
Celosvetovo zhruba 750 miliard kubíkov vody. Tento proces sa odštartoval po druhej svetovej vojne. Dá sa povedať, že teraz sme v polčase rozpadu vodného cyklu a o 50 rokov bude vlastne definitívny kolaps s vodnými zdrojami na globálnej úrovni.
There is another problem with increased urbanization, which is our continued insistence to build housing for growing populations that demand more water than local watersheds can provide.
People in the housing development, and they make money by turning houses, and they're very large companies. So their goal is to avoid the water issue that might limit the number of houses they might have.
Instead of adapting our development to the available water supply of a region, we choose to force the world's water supply to adapt to our desired locations.
What dams do is change the hydrologic cycle. They provide water during those months when the natural flow patterns do not.
What's happened is that we built these huge hydro dams mainly to create hydropower and hydroelectricity. And when we've done that, we've done it in a very narrow framework. And we haven't thought about the fact that we're going to need water for other purposes.
In this quest to conquer nature, as some label it, we've constructed close to 50,000 large dams worldwide. But if we are headed towards desertification by allowing too much rainwater to run off into the sea, then is it not to our benefit to dam water and prevent it from reaching the sea?
One of the basic functions of rivers is to carry stuff from one place to another. And that stuff, which is really critical to the health of an entire watershed, it becomes completely and wholly interrupted when you build a dam.
Dammed rivers fail to carry such nutrients and minerals downstream through the watershed, resulting in more soil erosion, less percolation when it rains, more runoff, and thus an increase in the desertification problem.
When you trap water, it stops moving, and when it stops moving, it heats up because it's this nice warm soup full of nutrients that are not making it downstream. But then those things die, and then they eat up oxygen. All of a sudden, you've got a major water quality problem.
A river is the lifeblood of an ecosystem, just like the veins and arteries bring blood to every part of our organism. When we have choked arteries, that's what's called a heart attack. A dam is the choking of the artery of the planet.
So we really have to face the crisis here that what we were taught in school, that this finite amount of water could never run out, is technically true. But if you can't access it because you took it from an aquifer and you poured it into a desert to grow cotton, or you polluted it, it's of no use to us. And that's what we need to get into our heads. And there's nowhere to go in the world to get away from this. Rich people and people who live in water-rich countries will get away from it longer than people who are facing it now. But the world water crisis will face us all. But if there is going to be one single thing that is going to slam us into reality, it is going to be running out of water.
We see all sorts of fresh water in our lakes and say, well, you know, what's the problem? We've got lots of fresh water. Once you drain a lake, that's it. There is no more water. We have to start focusing in on what is the renewable supply, which comes through the hydrologic cycle. We are creating a situation where we have less and less of that renewable supply left. And with the help of water scientists, we have to really start to assess how much water we really do have to work with. What is that renewable supply, and trying to define it. That's the task at hand. We must be able to find out what the limits are and how to live within them.
Massively ship water out of an area, the ecosystem is disrupted, the natural habitat damaged, biodiversity reduced, and aquifers dried. The water-rich area we chose to export from will itself desertify. The thirsty populations in the water-poor deserts we ship water to will simply consume the water and send it back to the sea via its sewers, thus still remaining a desert. Where one desert region existed before, two deserts now exist.
You're using water from an ecosystem in Northern California, transporting it through long pipes and canals to Southern California to grow alfalfa. The alfalfa is then shipped to places like Japan, where it is fed to the high-end Kona beef, and then much of that beef is shipped back to the U.S. So we've set up this system of agriculture that just doesn't work anymore, and it's really based on the concept of virtual water, where we're growing crops for export in thirsty places and then moving them long distances, rather than having our food grown more locally and more sustainably. China is a very dry country, but agribusiness is moving there because there are fewer laws and labor is very cheap. Almost all apple juice sold in the United States comes from China now. We're losing our ability to even grow apples because it's cheaper to produce them elsewhere. That means that a country like China that doesn't have very much water is exporting its water to the United States through apples. Then we sign trade agreements like NAFTA so that our subsidized corn using water from desert-like areas in the U.S. can undersell the farmers in Mexico. A lot of that water actually stays in the corn and is then transported to another ecosystem and is completely lost.
For instance, here in Kenya, they grow most of the roses that are sold in Europe, and they export them. And they're grown around a beautiful, beautiful lake called Lake Naivasha, which is being depleted at an appalling rate.
All done by foreign corporations, huge, great big flower plantations. If they keep doing this, within 5 years it will be a putrid puddle. So here's one of the driest continents on Earth, exporting water, being told by the World Bank to export its water to get its way out of debt.
You don't know when the water would flow. It flows once a week, and you don't know the date, the time. So you are forced to open up the tap. When they open their taps, it's air. And when the air blows through the taps, the meters are running, and they are charged for doing this.
There's a pipe coming up, and between the pipe and the tap, there's a water meter. And you have to pay for an electronic key to get charged up. And you can look at it and you can see the water meter counting every single drop. And as one friend of mine said, I can afford about 2 flushes a month from this thing. That's how expensive it is. You know, they just throw their hands up in despair and they go back to that river that has cholera warning signs on it.
If people don't have money to buy water, they go to polluted streams, they get sick. The state has to pay for their health care. You know, why don't you just use money for the necessary thing and to prevent other things that might come up? If in the house I'm the only one employed and I buy water, I'm going to limit or ration the people who are living in that house. That's why then you get domestic violence. Because now I want to do my laundry, but because my sister is the only one employed, she determines when I do my laundry. You know, parents will take the tokens that they use into making sure that the water can run, you know, wherever they go, maybe to work and all that. And then during the day, kids don't have water. And this other woman who lived in a shack with 2 kids took the token and went with it to work. And the shack caught fire. And there was no water to stop the fire. And even the neighbors are saying, we don't have money to stop hair fire, you know? These projects are taking away our humaneness.
Emergency aid to provide something as basic as water. Why are they unable to build their own infrastructure of clean water delivery? Why are they poor?
Developing countries are forced to grow cash crops, export crops like tea or coffee.
We've got some resources, especially tea, which is really growing all over. The World Bank and the IMF and the other countries, especially the Western world, that buys the tea from our country always gives us a raw deal. You find that we are given so little money for this tea.
The World Trade Organization has required developing countries to remove tariffs so that products can flow in and out of the country because it benefits are corporations. They get cheap products. Now what that means is that developing countries are very hurt.
And it's obscene. It's why these countries can't get out of debt, and it's why these countries can't develop water systems or healthcare or anything else for their kids. And there's a famous Senate hearing where a very senior World Bank official told the U.S. Senate, don't worry, we're not giving money away, particularly for every dollar the United States invests in the developing world through the World Bank. American corporations get back $1.30. You know, wink, wink. We call it aid, development aid, but really it's forcing countries to open up their resources, and that's why there's such a tremendous reaction against the World Bank in the third world.
If we were to sell this tea at the right price, if we had fair trade in the markets, our tea could fetch enough money that can sustain most of our needs.
It should be a very rich country.
We cannot fight the world water crisis by just saying, let's hook up some more people and hope that does it. We have to challenge the systems that deliberately create winners from losers. And then who cares about the losers? That they're losers and it's their own fault anyway. That's the system we have to take on, and we will never, 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 never solve the world water crisis until we have the courage to talk about the world political and economic system.
Wherever a river flowing free is now treated as the supplier of raw material as if it was oil, we have the generation of water wars.
The Chinese, the symbol for water, not only means water, it means control, which I think is quite profound in the sense that controlling water is everything.
And the word rivals, for instance, comes from Latin meaning river. The rivals were people standing on either side of the river throwing things at each other.
And you're just going to see more of that as the technology develops to be able to suck water out of the atmosphere. Now you're going to find water from the atmosphere and clouds being stolen.
New techniques for controlling the weather are being tried. When conditions are right, rain is made to fall by seeding clouds with dry ice or silver iodine.
It's happening in China and some other places where a particular village pays for a plane to go up. They make it rain before the cloud gets to the next village. So there's real anger and real political tension.
The worst case is Southern California. And LA is part of what I call hydraulic civilizations, like Rome and its aqueducts was a hydraulic civilization. But there the longest aqueduct was 60 miles. The longest you have to go, once measured it, is 1,400 miles from the furthest source of water for LA to a home in the town. And LA has not yet figured out what its limit should be. I mean, it doesn't want a limit. In the LA area itself, which is about 18 million, if it was on its own water, it would only be 3 million. First thing LA is going to do is try to put a lot of farmers out of work and close down the farms and take that water. When the water system doesn't work, then the civilization goes. The last great water war in the United States was 1934, when Arizona sent in the National Guard because California, again, was building a dam across the Colorado to divert the water to California without giving Arizona any. And the ferry captain that took people across the Colorado put a cannon on the front of her ferry, and they went up and threatened the dam. But it led to the Secretary of the Interior to stop the dam.
One of the most bloody water wars is still being fought over the river Kaveri, that farmers of Karnataka and farmers of Tamil Nadu both required more water out of that river. A bandit of Tamil origin, Veerappan, kidnapped a Karnataka actor with the demand that large amounts of water be released to Tamil Nadu. It was really as a chess game in the water wars. I was doing a major study on conflicts over resources for the United Nations University. This fat file of mine on river water conflicts suddenly had no more coverage because the entire issue was now being presented as an issue of religion, not water demands and water conflicts. So many water wars are presented as religious conflicts, when in reality they are fundamental conflicts over resources.
Well, I want to tell you about one country tonight, and that's the country of Bolivia, South America's poorest country. Several years ago, the World Bank refused to guarantee a $25 million loan to finance the investment program of the local water co-op, and forced Bolivia to sell its water systems to a subsidiary of Bechtel. The water prices now account in Bolivia for more than they pay for food. Well, I have a story to tell you tonight, and that is that the people rose up in Bolivia.
Obrero industrial, y cuando en Bolivia se privatizó el agua, la gente, nosotros no podíamos concebir que un empresario privado, un inversionista transnacional, podía apropiarse del agua. Es decir, la gente o tenía que pagar del agua o tenía que dejar de comer y por lo tanto no tuvo otra alternativa que decir no a la privatización del agua. Una rebelión popular, una forma organizativa de multitudes de gente, que desde los campesinos hasta los vendedores de las calles, y empezamos una resistencia. El gobierno sacó al ejército y a la policía para garantizar la seguridad jurídica de la empresa, garantizar las utilidades y las ganancias de la compañía.
But it's really interesting, as you know, the World Bank has imposed the same kind of private control and takeover of many other things in developing countries. Healthcare, education, their energy sector, their mines, and so on. But when it comes to water, something happens and people say, I couldn't stop you there, or I didn't know how, or I thought maybe you would be right, but you are not taking my local water.
Asociados de una abierta complicidad de los gobernantes en ese tiempo en Bolivia, que inclusive se privatizó el agua de la lluvia, es decir, que se prohibía a la gente el acumular el agua de la lluvia.
And this is where you get the civil wars, because the army is brought in to control local dissent against these transnational corporations. Who are you protecting? There's your people without drinking water, and you're protecting foreign investors from North America and Europe?
Más de 100 heridos de bala, numerosos detenidos. Civil, hubieron más de 20 francotiradores que mataron e hirieron a la gente.
17-year-old Victor Hugo Doza was killed by a shot through his face.
We're going to see a whole new geopolitical picture emerging here, where the world map will be rewritten and redesigned. They've already mapped out what are going to be the most intense areas of potential conflict in the next 10, 15, and 20 years. So the water-rich areas of the world are Brazil, Canada, Russia.
So these big superpowers are beginning to position themselves in such a way that water, like energy, is seen as part of their future security, including their military security, including their commercial security. And they're beginning to understand they have to secure future sources of water. The U.S. is doing military training around the Great Lakes, and 80 mayors of towns and cities around the lakes have asked the U.S. government to suspend this, but they're not going to. I got involved in this issue in the mid-1980s when Canada was negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States, and the free trade agreement included water as a good. There was a statement made by one of the participants that Canadian water
would be flowing to the United States Midwest from the Canadian North by pipeline within 2 to 5 years. Who knew?
And move that water into a crater in the Rocky Mountains, which would be kind of like a huge mega reservoir.
And nobody will stand up in our country to the United States administration and say, this is our water, because they know that the United States would consider that as serious as if we put missiles along the Canada-US border. It just would not be tolerated in the US.
In the new regime, where water is being treated like oil, the protection of that commodity is being ensured through a militarized defense.
And the good part of Brazil sits over top of the largest aquifer in the world, which is called the Guarani Aquifer. This is going to be a major source of fresh water in the future. Very recently, the United States has established a military base located just inside the border of Paraguay. As you know, it remains to be seen what will happen and what they're doing there exactly as to whether the purpose of that military base is really to secure a military presence at a very pivotal location for exercising some measure of control over the Guarani Aquifer and water takings from the Guarani Aquifer. In the last few weeks, there's been a report in the media about George W. Bush, the president, purchasing land in Paraguay. The speculation is that that has to do with wanting to have access to the aquifer and pump water out of the aquifer. Jenna Bush, who is the daughter of George W. Bush, had paid a quiet 10-day visit to Paraguay, in particular meeting with top officials in the government. And as it turned out, what was happening, at least this was what the speculation was in the press, was that she was about to facilitate the purchase of something like 100,000 acres of land in Paraguay in her family name. At the same time, though, that was happening, it was discovered that George Bush Sr. already had something like 173,000 acres of land. Was this an example of the Bush oil family now switching from black gold to blue gold, turning to water and purchasing water? Clearly after that, there were a series or a string of denials on the part of the Bush family. Not directly, they did it through agencies, U.S. government agencies.
Eles negam a construção da base.
The world's largest dam is located very close to that area, and so that also was a matter of considerable interest for the U.S. as well.
And just 2 days ago, the Bolivian government gave in and kicked Bechtel out of the country. Humble Bolivians, led by a 45-year-old, kicked one of the world's biggest engineering companies out of the country for its criminal behavior and told the World Bank to go the hell with it.
Bueno, 2 días después de la victoria popular, yo tuve la posibilidad de viajar a Washington. Primera vez en mi vida que salí a Estados Unidos. Segunda vez en mi vida que salía fuera de mi país.
And this simple shoemaker from Cochabamba, Bolivia, gave one of the most moving speeches I have ever heard.
Solo somos dueños del agua y del aire. The only thing that is ours anymore is our water and our air.
Posibilitó la pérdida del miedo que se tiene frente a los poderes constituidos económicos, financieros, políticos y militares. Es que la única fuerza capaz de transformar el mundo, capaz de transformar la sociedad, es esa capacidad de unidad, de organización y de movilización de la gente frente a cualquier poder.
And people were so moved, they not only clapped for him, they got up on their chairs. It was like a standing ovation that wouldn't end. It was just a stellar moment. Because this is a really scary story, and it's a true story, and we really are running out of water. It doesn't have to be that way, okay? And that's the most important thing to say, is that it's not too late. The earth is amazingly elastic in terms of coming back. The ability of the earth to renew itself is stunning.
Riešením je veľmi jednoduché. Vrátiť vodu do vodného cyklu a začať zavodňovať krajinu dažďovou vodou.
We need to dig holes. If we dig holes in the sand, we can trick the water into staying so it doesn't run away to a river or ocean when it rains. The water will sit in the holes and soak into the ground. Then more trees will grow.
We prepare very simple, very cheap solution.
There's a huge difference between these water catchments and dams, because dams, what happens is that a large amount of water, land area gets flooded. We create these huge reservoirs, then the water becomes stagnant in them, and the mercury, it starts to spread throughout the water system itself, and it creates a whole different set of problems. In these water catchments, what happens is that the water is trapped so that it goes right into the ground itself, and therefore starts to replenish the groundwater systems. And it, quite frankly, is the antidote to desalinization. This is the kind of approach that we need to take in order to revitalize and rebuild our groundwater systems.
And then we have to stop going into the groundwater and taking it out in such a phenomenally cavalier way.
In the U.S., the largest amount of groundwater is being used for agriculture. And you really have to deal with agriculture to solve our water problems.
The water efficiency with hydroponic systems is 20 to 30 times more efficient than crops growing outdoors.
The reason is that we are placing the water directly to the base of the crop through drip or trickle irrigation systems.
We can take that fish called tilapia, and when they grow in this water, we can take that nutrient-rich water and go on to crops with that. And any excess of water going onto the roots, it's collected. It can go back to the fish and then go through the system again. And it's these technologies that will save this planet in the next century.
There's a move towards decommissioning these dams, taking them down, and that movement, that trend towards decommissioning is really important. But it sets the stage also that we need to move towards alternative ways of supplying the power that's necessary, whether it be through these micro-turbines.
That are in stream completely. You don't need a dam to hold back water. They just use the natural flow of rivers or coasts. Korea has been investing in this technology. Scandinavia has. I mean, they're sort of seeing their era of large dam building coming to an end as well.
As we expand urbanization to meet our growing population needs, there are alternative permeable pavement solutions which allow rainwater to infiltrate through into the subsoil. Pollutants from cars are filtered and removed and thus do not pollute the groundwater. The water quality is actually improved. Even with these advancements, the ultimate development solution is to limit the population growth of a region pending on the available water supply, which is exactly what the citizens of Bolinas, California did.
And so the towns decided that they would put a moratorium on all housing growth until they had adequate supply of water. And that water moratorium was challenged immediately and was in courts for 14 years. They just didn't want a town to be able to control growth. They considered it interference with commerce. But ultimately we won, and yeah, it's working.
What we can learn from the Bolinas example is the whole challenge to learn to live within the limits of our watersheds.
And in this village where we really have shortage of water, we use some water that is being poured on your hands as you wash your hands sparingly. And people really value any amount of water that they have.
It's exactly the opposite of America. I mean, America could save 20 to 30% of its water really easily. If we adopted the toilet style of Israel, for instance, which has two buttons, one for urine and one for feces, the one for urine is less than a quart.
To call for a United Nations convention that explicitly states that water is a human right and a public trust that must not be denied to anyone on the basis of inability to pay.
Demanding that we put this language in an international framework at the United Nations.
Because the operations of these corporations, these water barons, have now gone global, this has gone beyond nation-state law and requires us to bring in some kind of instrument at an international level to control these companies.
This week at the World Social Forum is being launched an historic organization, the African Water Network.
A world that is going to say no to commodification of our common goods.
to mobilize and protect Africa's precious water sources from abuse and from corporate theft.
Now we have a defiance campaign that says, okay, you can install your meter. After you turn your back, we take it out, we connect the pipes, and then we throw your meter away.
What water is in my backyard? What's the name of the watershed I live in? We should all know that, just the way we know our town and our state. And then ask the question, where does your drinking water come from? And where does your wastewater go? Just start asking the questions. You don't even have to do anything. Just ask the questions.